Everyone, today I have the great pleasure to interview Harry Yoon, the editor of Minari, a beautiful film showing at ACX Cinemas locations. And I'm Patrick White with ACX Cinemas, interviewing Harry. And I'd like to start by asking, how did you become involved in this project?
Sure. First, thanks for having me on. It's such a pleasure to talk to your audience. Thank you for being here. For for me, I got involved when I was introduced to the director, Lee Isaac Chung, by our producer, Christina Oh. Christina and I had worked together on a movie called Last Black Man in San Francisco.
Okay.
And we had such a wonderful time that any project she brought to me, I was interested in. But when I read the script, it was like little explosions of memory for me because I grew up around that time period. We were an immigrant family. I mean, we didn't grow up in Arkansas. We grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, but there was so much about the script that resonated for me. So when I got a chance to talk to Isaac about it, I was just like, I have to do this movie. And I think he got a sense of my enthusiasm and my identification with the material. And that's what started the relationship.
Excellent. Well, and I'm curious to know, from an editor's point of view, what do you think the general audiences misunderstand most about an editor's job?
I think because our job is to make the experience as seamless as possible, when you experience a film, I think it just sort of washes over you in such a way where you don't necessarily see the choices and the crafting behind it. I think some audiences see it often if the editing is very pronounced, like if there are fast cuts or if there are cuts that sort of don't initially make sense, and then you have to kind of catch up to what the meaning is supposed to be. But a lot of the time, if something kind of washes over you in a seamless way, that means the editor has done their job well. But ironically, it means, in the way that, like, if you look at a good join carpentry wise, right? You're not noticing the join, you're just noticing the form of a chair or a table or something like that. And
Right.
so I think it's sometimes our art is a little bit too hidden if we do it well.
I like that perspective. Hopefully, I'm not calling you out too much here because I still think that the film is seamless, no doubt. But I did notice these really interesting methods of editing.
Mm.
So when watching, what struck me is how you used sound to connect shots and scenes together. Like a particularly funny transition I was noticing this morning was David wetting the bed, transitions to him filling a cup with Mountain Dew.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious to know, like, were those transitions established with you and the director, or is that something that organically happened?
It's something that you look to do to use sound as a tool throughout to underscore particular moments or to direct sometimes to direct the eye, or not just the mind, but the eye. So for example, there was this wonderful moment that happened later in the film where Yoon Yo-jung's character experiences a stroke.
Hmm.
And there's this shot where a fly just happened to land on her face.
Oh, really?
And it's just this kind of like, some people have asked, is that a VFX fly or something like that? But it just emphasizes the fact that she can't quite move the way that she used to. And it's so cinematically resonant. And so in order to enhance the audience's noticing of that, we actually added the sound of a fly in earlier shots in that same scene so that you're aware that the presence of something until it makes itself visible. And so there are times in which, yes, we're always using sounds to either connect moments or bring you into moments or emphasize certain moments. And it's one of the layers, one of the tools that editors use always.
I think it's a film I'll revisit often because, like I said before, though the editing is seamless, I think there are creative choices that you make that really just add to the storytelling.
Mm. Yeah, I think one of the things that really defined this particular cutting process was what we had to remove. This was definitely one in which, because the film and the script were a collection of Isaac's memories, and because there wasn't a strong kind of timeline through it, there were certain seasons that the farm went through and that the characters went through. we had a lot of freedom in choosing what do we include, what do we not include. And so we cut over 30 scenes, large and small, during the editorial process. And what we found was that the more we focused on what are the essential things that give you the sense of what the family is going through, and probably more importantly, balancing your perspective between not just the kids, not just David, who's kind of, the hero that we identify with, but also the parents. What are they going through at this time? And in balancing those perspectives, I think what emerges is more of a portrait of a family and their relationship versus the journey of an individual protagonist, like a particular hero that we follow through the story. And I think that that's what gives people a variety of ways to enter the film. Do you identify as a father? Do you identify as a son who remembers his father? Do you identify as a mother who's caring for the family, or as a grandmother who wants, who doesn't quite fit in but wants nothing but good for the family? So I think that balancing allows people to enter the story in different ways and maybe take something away from the story that they might not have if we just focused on one character.
Very eloquently put.
Thank you.
I'll definitely notice that next time I watch it. Another kind of aspect, it sort of ties in with what we were just talking about, cutting. How difficult was that for something like the silent, not silent montages, but the montages with music?
That's where it's such a pleasure that we had the opportunity to work with Emile Mosseri's music early on. Emile, incidentally, was the composer on Last Black Man in San Francisco, so I had already heard his gorgeous music, but it's very rare when a composer can come on before we start shooting. Often they're brought on after shooting is done and maybe like months into the post-production process. So they're usually sort of catching up to creative decisions that have been made already. But one of the beautiful things about having some of Emile's score early on was it sort of infiltrated our understanding of the emotion of particular moments. Like, what does it feel like to look at the land and to start a farm? That sense of optimism, and what is it, how it's kind of tinged with reverie too, because it's also a memory. And so I had those themes early on, and they were kind of in my DNA as I was choosing images, particularly for the montages. And so we wanted things that had that sense of beauty and optimism, but weren't necessarily obvious. So sometimes in showing the kids walking through the field, maybe you don't see their faces, but you see them sort of exploring woods, in the way that kids would experience being like, oh, I wonder what's in here. So trying to convey that kind of subjective experience and that sense of wonder, I think was really influenced by Emile's music. And so we're very lucky to have collaborated early on with him.
Another thing that really works about this film is the balance of humor and drama. And I'm curious to know how you approach editing humor versus drama in a scene.
It's great. I think, one simple thing is humor is so much about timing, so much about, and it really could get down to frames. Like, you have 24 frames within a second, but sometimes that half second or partial second, as anybody who's tried to tell a joke and failed will tell you, that sometimes that little pause or that absence of a pause is what makes something funny. And in the same way, we can control that through when we cut, what angle we cut to, what look we cut to. And so much of the humor is focused on timing. For performance, I would say that it's based on truth. And does something feel real to you? And how do you remove anything that falls short of that? Maybe sort of it could be a little glance by whoever you're focused on, or a word reading that you have to replace in the audio. And so you're constantly trying to maintain that consistent feeling of truth through the whole performance by putting together and sometimes removing things that would break the audience out of that spell. And so I think those are two simple reasons. Obviously, there's a lot of other things that go into it, but I would say as principles, those are two things that you're constantly looking for.
And did you have influences in mind as you were editing?
Definitely. I think in talking with Isaac about the film, he was influenced by filmmakers like a Japanese filmmaker like Hirokazu Koreeda, who's made some beautiful films that are more observational about relationships and families in Japan.
Yeah.
And Koreeda is not afraid to hold if there's something that is developing in the frame.
Hmm.
And so you'll notice that at times we're kind of holding longer than one would normally think on a
Absolutely.
particular frame.
Hmm.
And there's a really good reason for that because there's a way in which, by being still, we see little ways in which the relationship is developing, little histories in the relationship. So, my favorite example of this is when Sunja is unpacking her suitcase for Monica, and each item brings out this kind of reaction in Monica. And there's a way in which their interactions, the pauses, the little crying, wait, you're crying? Why are you crying over this? You know, that type, those little interactions. I think when you hold in that frame, you're just kind of like saying, oh, like this seems like such a pedestrian thing to unpack a suitcase. And yet you're by being still, I think you're able to read the little nuances that are happening in that relationship. So yeah, it's in. I think definitely that style of filmmaking influenced us in our editing choices.
Something else that I noticed, sort of again related to that, was there wasn't a lot of like shot, reverse shot, and cutting between those types of shots. The dialogue scenes were often wide, and uh, is that preferable for you to work with shots like that versus cutting back and forth?
I think it's important to try to give the audience some new information with each angle, ideally.
Hmm. Yeah.
Sometimes, in a long dialogue scene, it's unavoidable because, you eventually have to sort of switch perspectives to say, like, how is this character reacting to that? Or, are they introducing a new topic? That type of thing. But I like to save angles if possible so that it tells the audience or it directs the audience, hey, something new is happening. Notice this.
Hmm.
And what I see sometimes is, especially in, and I did this too when I was first starting off, was like, I thought it was like anytime somebody's saying something important, you have to be on that person. But I think what that does is it kind of that it the scenes start to lose visual interest for an audience. And
Hmm.
so I think that's why I like to be a spare, if especially if there's interesting things happening in the frame in this kind of movie in which we've already established a kind of like more meditative pace, a kind of thoughtful pace that it gives you the luxury of just holding on for a little bit to particular angles and maybe even not returning to those angles sometimes. One of my favorite scenes that shows that is the hospital scene where they're in the hallway and Jacob and Monica are just talking about, what this experience has meant to them.
Hmm.
And uh, I think in that scene, we almost never reuse an angle once we leave it. And the design of that is specifically for this very long scene in which, there's a lot of dialogue for the audience to sort of be like, oh, suddenly I'm seeing it from a slightly different perspective. And sometimes it's literal, and sometimes it's literal in that we've changed the frame, but
Right.
hopefully also that something has shifted in their understanding of their relationship too.
Well, and kind of on the reverse side of things, what motivates quicker cuts or maybe just more cuts? I noticed a scene early on in the film when there were multiple cuts as the children were creating the paper airplanes,
Mhm.
saying "Don't fight," and I saw that it cut more. What motivated that choice?
Definitely, definitely that's something that you do when you want to communicate a particular frenetic energy or
Hmm.
dynamism going on.
Sure.
Especially because that was also cross-cutting with the similar cutting pattern when they're fighting, when the parents are fighting. So there's a lot of energy, there's heightened emotion, and cuts can sort of like, startle us in a way that makes us sort of subjectively experience the emotion of what's going on. A
Hmm.
very similar cutting pattern you see when Paul, their neighbor, and their employees is anointing the house with oil,
Hmm.
and there's just these like little glimpses, these little jump cuts that jump forward in time that give that impression of like, oh, there's something interesting, something energetic going on. And then you land on David and Anne, who are kind of a little bit scared, like this behavior and yelling in the house is a little scary. And so you want to sort of communicate that subjective experience of energy or dislocation or confusion.
I really appreciate all the time you've given me already. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I'll finish with one final question. Do you have any new projects coming up, and is there a genre of film you'd love to explore as an editor?
That's a great question. I am on a project currently. Unfortunately, I can't talk about it due to NDA, but it's a much bigger scale than Minari, so it's been really fun to play in those waters. And as far as your last question, yeah, I'd love to kind of experience a little more comedy actually, because I know that that's one of the hardest things to cut because of exactly what we talked about, because of the timing of everything. But
Right.
yeah, that would be really fun.
Well, and I think you'd be a natural, I mean, you already are a natural fit for comedy, and the tendency of kind of mainstream comedy is to cut too much almost,
Yeah.
to create that sort of frenetic energy, but I think you let comedy breathe just as you do with the drama in the film. So,
Thank you, Patrick.
yeah.
It was such a pleasure speaking with you, and I really appreciate it.